Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being with us in this wonderful theatre. And for my final chapter, I decided to be more understated, but that's already out of the window. I wanted to do without accessories because my previous outfits are nothing but memories and confetti. So let's enter the final chapter. It's entitled Of Ink and Light and should continue to impress you. After the history of paper, of its volume, its manufacture, its recycling, we'll talk about printing. To begin our session, we are privileged to have Joseph Belletante with us today. He's the Chief Heritage Curator and Director of the Museum of Printing and Graphic Communication, and he will take us on a journey through the art of printing in the West. Hello everyone, I'm delighted to be here with you this morning for a rather special Gutenberg brunch. I have the daunting task of taking you on a journey through the history of printing, from Renaissance to the present days, from Gutenberg to Warhol. We'll do that slowly and calmly, and I've chosen 15 works, objects or images to introduce you to this somewhat complicated, horribly complicated topic that is printing, because it involves hundreds of techniques that are difficult to explain just like that. It takes artists and printers, and they have to work together. So I'll try to do that, and you know the first object. Obviously, I'm going to start with Gutenberg. So, 15 objects, 15 images, and each time after these images, I have a few examples. So for this first image, what's interesting is that you can see that Gutenberg is not alone. And by the way, Gutenberg is not the one who invented printing. The third thing I need to say is that Gutenberg is Steve Jobs, absolutely Steve Jobs. He's somebody who needs money at all times. He is borrowed in debt. He makes a living out of mirror making that he sells to pilgrims coming to Mayence. So at that time they needed a mirror on their pilgrimage, and that's how he made a living. He was born in Mayence, Germany, not far from a vineyard, not far from the first abbeys and monasteries, and he saw books as a potential market, but he needed to make money. So he put together a strange task force of 10 people who locked themselves in cellars in Strasbourg and said, we're going to build a device that will enable us to make books, and if possible, to make them very quickly. He didn't know where he was going, but he wanted to get there, and he knew it would be a good idea. I told you about vineyards. It's because the press comes from that. We'll talk about paper, but the press is also important. Gutenberg also invented a certain form of design. That is to say, the object he created with his people, the Gutenberg press, as you can see here, lasted for almost 400 years. There were very few changes. Some parts were made from wood and then from metal, but very few things changed until the advent of the rotary presses for newspapers. And it was really at the end of the 19th century that we were able to type desks that we wanted to print. This is what was called linotype. But between the Gutenberg press and linotype, there was very little change. So this is quite rare. Gutenberg made this object and made it to print a Bible. Of course, this was in 1450, and it took him 5 years from the time he started using the press to produce the first Bible. It was called the Bible B of 42. And it's an absolutely incredible object. It's really interesting. And to the left you can see a Korean book called Gigli. I think I started working at the museum several years ago, and I think the first appointment I had was with Korean person who wanted to tell me something right away. And it was quite impressive, but he said to me, this is a book that we have, which is called Jiggly, which no one knows about. It's a book that really dates back from before Gutenberg. She was a Korean researcher. So the Jiggly that you can see was printed in 1377. It's a book printed like Gutenberg's book, using metal characters that were assembled together and pressed onto a sheet of paper. So Gutenberg didn't invent anything. Jiggly was rediscovered at BNF in 1979 by a Korean researcher, meaning that before 1979, no one knew the book existed. The Koreans didn't know about that. So the first book is Jiggly. And of course, if you ask China and Japan, they will say that's not true. It was us who were the first. But it's this type of triangle between China, Japan, and Korea that invented the technique that then migrated to Europe. Then the second object I wanted to talk to you is about the anti-Mars cabinet. It's quite astonishing. But in 1943, the museum where I work received a phone call from the director of the Bern Library, who was who was working on a philosophy book. The works of Galen restored. When the restorer opened the book, he found little pieces of confettis. He gathered them and recreated the poster which is left behind me. And this is a very virulent text. In 1577, Luther wrote text that led to the Protestant religion, and this was printed in Neuchâtel, and that was disseminated all the way to the sleeping quarters of Francis I, saying the Mass kills Jesus Christ because this is witchcraft that prevents us from focusing on Jesus Christ himself. So that's very violent. And this text is not very famous. Furious, François Ier banned the display of this placard, and then he modified his plans and started reprisals against all people that participated in printing this placard. Some of them were taken to the stake. And it's uncommon because that's an A4 format. So how can you produce such extraordinary quality of printing on such small format? It is crazy work to see how you can make paper beautiful, how it can be shared in different shapes and formats. Now, this placard is back that a poster saying where you have to display posters to advertise for markets. But then you also have talking statues. You have 15 talking statues in Rome, and you see the messages displayed around these statues. These are the first popular claims. You had demands, you had a problem, you wanted to protest, you displayed your poster next to the statue. It's quite beautiful, and that's the very beginning of demonstrations. And that's a beautiful engraving, but the statues can be seen in Rome, some of them, and they're absolutely beautiful. The third object is very small. The picture is big, but the object is very small. That's 16 centimeters over 19 centimeters. And on such a small format, engravers managed to do this work. So behind me you have the walk of the Hebrews in the desert that's reproduced on wood with a knife, a pen knife. It's an incredible work. If you look at the details and the contrasts, that's a technique called xylography, engraving on wood. So that's a wood that cut in the length So this wood allows, when you take apple trees, cherry trees, pear trees, it's hardwood. So when you start cutting it with a penknife, you can use it as a stamp, and then you can stamp paper with this. This print is the very definition of printing. It's leaving a print on various support, on various media, and then stamp it on the paper. So we are at a stage where paper is still soft, and it's mostly the texts and the images which are printed which are of interest. So we talked about Gutenberg, we talked about the anti-Mars poster or placard. This is xylography, which was invented in Asia in the 7th century and reaches Europe at the end of the 14th century. We have the proto wood, which is the first one that we know in Europe, and that dates back to 1420. At the bottom right, you have a stamp, and you have a small name. It's Pierre Escriche, but Pierre Escriche is the engraver. Is he the one who engraved the image? Sometimes it said Master Imer. It can be the same person, it can be two different persons. Everything changes and evolves. So the revolution that we started experiencing there embodies everything that we experience in the digital era. You can copy the 400 years of the print revolution to what we experience today. Revolution in images, censorship, it's never ending. And the revolution in the media is something that we've experienced already. So the interest is to spot out things that we help us better understand where we stand. You see here this knife that allows you to sculpt stone, but also for wood engraving or xylography. The fourth image, playing cards. This is a tarot card. This is arcane number 7, the chariot. That means emancipation. Once again, impossible to say when that came along. Up until 2003, we believed that playing cards were invented in China in the 13th century. But a recent article shows that they were invented much sooner than that. So they printed cards, and once they printed the motives in xylography, lithography, to put images on a piece of paper, they added 4 sheets of paper, they smoothed them with soap to give a cardboard aspect to this paper, cardboard card. And they became popular and they multiplied, and this is why we needed machines to do things faster. So these are images, and you can see here that we engrave with a penknife. This is what we call a relief technique. When you cut out with your penknife, it's the non-hollowed parts that can be used for stamping. The other technique is a soft technique, so you engrave, and it's the engraved part that's printed on the paper. Now we move to text. I told you that Gutenberg was a mirror maker. So when we talk about the characters, the making of the characters, what kind of metal is he going to use? Well, the same one he's been using for his mirror, which is made of lead and antimony. And this is the mixture he uses to make the characters, the letters. And therefore they reflect the light, and you have a mirror effect, and that's retained as if it was normal, but that was kind of an emergency solution for Gutenberg. And by the way, Gutenberg died crippled with debt, but the press survived him, and the state is going to take ownership of this creation in order to retain order, but also to install order. One order is text, the way you express, the way you write, and this was soon understood by Louis XIV, which creates a national font called the Roman of the King, or the King's Roman. When you read it, you feel that it's the King writing to you, and it's a tradition that replaces the Italian typography, because when Gutenberg invented the press moved to Lyon and then to Venice, and Venice became a very important center for printing and created all the Roman characters. So these are the King's Roman characters, of fonts, and you see that there is a double leg that almost links the C to the T, and that makes it obvious to recognize this font. And recognizing font or creating new font, that's absolutely fantastic. And those people who design new fonts are doing an absolutely amazing work. And all presidents choose their font in order to take ownership of their discourse, and so that order is controlled even in the way characters are written. We have two national characters because the Ministry of Culture decided to create two new characters. The first one is to the right, called The Infinite by Sandrine Nugue, and the last one by Alice Savoie, and it comes from the natural history by Buffon, and characters change like animals. It's free of rights. You can download it. So I could have talked about the French Revolution a bit more. I could have talked about the press. I could have talked about fonts and characters. During the Empire, the relationship to paper became different, and the relationship to readers became different. Let's take a stop and talk about this lithography. We'll talk about lithography later on, but I'd like to talk about it in two parts. So that's a cyanotype by Anna Atkins. She uses cyanotype that was just invented by Herschel in 1832. So it's a paper, you place a photosensitive solution, you place the paper in the sun, you place plants, leaves, and when you remove them, there is the print of the plant that remains on the paper, and the rest is the blue that remains on the paper. It looks like one technique, like many others, but that's a way of envisaging photography. And then we had many debates. When do photography books occur? This is probably one of the first ones. And Anna Atkins did some pretty crazy work as a botanist. She went out on her own with her father, and her father is also a botanist, and they created some kind of an encyclopedia of English plants and algae. So it's quite beautiful, and the images I'm showing come from Wikipedia Commons, by the way, and most of Watkins' atlases are available on Wikipedia Commons. So really, don't hesitate to go and explore these beautiful objects, which are quite beautiful and quite surprising. At the same time, anatomy and botany contribute to the rapid evolution of printing techniques. Experiments were carried out, and there is new techniques that appear, like the mezzotint technique. A few words about Julia Margaret Cameron. Won't say much because photography is not the topic of my talk today, but Julia Margaret Cameron is 48 when she's given her first camera. She had a great admiration for pre-Raphaelite painting. We were in London. She is Virginia Woolf's great aunt, and she took portraits of people around her, celebrities, her neighbors. She took photos of Herschel, of Darwin. She uses a kind of blurry chiaroscuro style of photography. It's really beautiful photography. And Anima for Success, as she calls it, is the first picture she's happy with. She's the daughter of her neighbors. She's called Annie. This is a beautiful picture taken in 1864. But photography transforms printing, and people can focus on other things than giving a faithful reproduction through printing. The first official picture is Talbot's book called The Pencil of Nature, which was made using the calotype process. And this is one of the first books with 24 plates, which shows a few scenes and places, and which is considered as one of the very first photo book. Mucha, quite a few things to know about this. Mucha often uses the same image for many different things. That's an advertisement for a paper called Reverie, but he used the same picture for biscuits and many other things. So what he does is that he captures Slavic motives. He dedicates 2/3 of his life trying to reproduce the artistic essence of Slavic visuals. So he started with advertising. He uses photography and chromolithography. Lithography is flat printing. We're no longer talking about hollows, but it's the printing on stone. It's printed with a fatty ink, and then it's inked. And the ink stops where you have a fat pencil, and then you can wash and do that again and many times. This is what lithography is about. Sometimes stones can be gigantic. They can be 2 meters high. Adverts in the metro are made on gigantic stones by artists who became publicists, and the mixture combination is quite subtle. Like for Mucha, is an artist, a publicist, an advertiser, like for authors who are writers and printers at the same time. Just mentioning Jenatche, she's a student, she studied with Mucha, and her style is quite close. Mucha used to hide the letter Q in his drawings. You can see the top and bottom part of the book that formed the letter Q. That was the way he signed, and there is also the combination between feminine and floral motive. Jenatche, there is a small museum dedicated to her, and she made wonderful ads back in the days. This one was about Jab cigarette paper. Now, Posada is a resistant, a journalist. He printed 15,000 stamps in his life, and he used small hand presses. He printed, and it's quite wonderful. So this is 20 centimeters, some are much smaller, 12 centimeters, and it's quite extraordinary. Posada is enraged by the bourgeois society in Mexico, and he designs caballeras. These are skeletal knights, a caricature like a French caricature, and he turns them into wonderful objects that are very influential in the Mexican population, but he died unknown, and Diego Rivera made his fame, and now he's considered as one of the greatest engraver in South America. I think he wanted to approach the truth. Now, graphic art As such, in the 1930s, as I said, printers could be artists, graphic designers, or advertisers. Austin Cooper is English. You see here a poster for an exhibition. He designed this one. It's a solemn head of Mercury. And this is where graphic design is emerging. That is to say, if you become a graphic designer, you create identities. It's your joy to be paid for that. And Austin Cooper was one of the first one, along with Maximilien Vox in France, that created the logo of the SNCF in the 1930s. But the British government decided to use Austin Cooper and his work to design all the maps of the London Underground and the British trains. And they created a real graphic signal language. In contrast, just before that, Verstetter is in Vienna, and he worked on postcards, so ephemeral documents, which took the work of designers to a level that is more familiar. Another object, the artist's book, that's a sculpture. This is René Jean-Claude, a painter, an engraver of Algerian origin. He is French. He writes poetry, and he's also an engraver and creates images using etching that involves carving a metal plate with a chisel before heating and etching it with acid. It looks simple, but it's not simple at all. So each time, it's a different technique. Some artists sometimes specialize in some techniques. What's interesting with this book is that we're moving into sculpture books. Paper is also like sculpture. It's displayed differently. The choice of paper here is arch paper, cotton paper, something very special. You have another book called Songs of Innocence. It's William Blake. It's done by Blake and his wife, Catherine. And it means that you move from the neat history, where you have one artist making one object, to messy history, where one object is designed by many people, and the place of women is back in the center. And this combat continues about this messy history, to give all their place to women. Other examples of artists' books, and it's funny to go from Gutenberg to the Rolling Stones, but I had to talk about this because then logo becomes visual identity, and this is where printing plays a huge role. By the way, Mick Jagger paid €50 to get this drawing done.
It was then used on the cover of Sticky Fingers, which came out in 1971, if I remember it correctly. And since Warhol did the cover of Sticky Fingers because it's jeans and a zip that goes up and down, everyone thought that Warhol had done that logo. In fact, it was Mick Jagger's brother who came back from India and brought him back some books. And Mick Jagger discovered the Indian goddesses, including Kali, whose mouth was open, and it's the goddess of destruction, and whose tongue was out. And through his brother, he got in touch with John Pache, who drew him a picture. The drawing became a direct copy. And a lawsuit meant that 20 years later, John Pache recovered sum of 15,000 euros for this drawing. So here again, we're dealing with something that was drawn very quickly. It's smarter than it looks. It's very interesting in terms of volume. It's going to be used as such. It's also going to stay on for 15 years. And you have here an object that is going to be one of the most seen, the most printed, when it's something that could have been done very differently. It's also this kind of experimentation time or surprise. You don't know why certain visual motifs will make more of an impression than others. Warhol was a very special period of time, episode. I was lucky enough to see a Warhol exhibition a short while ago, and you discover a character is completely different from the one you know. We're not dealing with some kind of monstrous ogre who just happens to take over a huge number of objects and techniques. He draws for magazines. He illustrates, he draws, and he makes his invitations by hand, and his postcards by hand. That's where the character as we know him really comes into his own. Here you have the Ladies and Gentlemen series. It's 1973, so not long after Sticky Fingers. So here we're talking about screen printing, and screen printing is stencil printing, in other words, as with the cyanotype, and you place a motif not on a sheet of paper but on a canvas, a nylon canvas. So you put several colors so that little by little the colors build up layers and become the object as we see it today. It's a very long and complex process. You immerse yourself in this technique. It's very surprising, and depending on how you use it, you may have accidents. And Warhol really liked these accidents. He didn't always produce these works. He also had a studio working on them. Here, the subject are the drag queens and transvestites he met in New York clubs in the 1960s, and the premise was to highlight both the search for the feminine ideal that they brought with them in their performances, but also their fame and desire for fame. The use of color, little like Muscha's use of auras I talked about earlier, it infused them with energy and made them iconic, which in 1973 was both a beautiful and pioneering gesture. Here you see a bay behind me. So the silk-screen techniques I was talking about earlier, the aluminium frame on which we have a patch of sun, you pass layers of colors, so the paper collects what the nylon frame allows to pass through. It's really a task that can be thought out in advance. There aren't usually too many problems between what you think and the result, but there are little incidents that come from the way the color can spill over, depending on whether the squeegee that puts the ink on is more or less deposited in the right places. Here you have Susan Kerr. She's a doctor of art in New York. She's a specialist in French caricature from the 19th century, Daumier, Dorier, big fan of 19th century caricature. And one day she gets a call, not from Gutenberg, obviously, but from Steve Jobs, who says, "Listen, I've got a job for you. Can you come along? It's not going to last very long." But in fact, it lasted 15 years, and she went on to create for Steve Jobs all the objects you see on your computer, images, drawings, from the hand that fetches a file to the file itself, from the watch that makes you wait to the bomb that explodes. She did it very simply. She was very modest about it. She had a sketchbook that would make up all of the tiles. She created the pixels on these squares and used them to create her images, and then she created a software program, or a software program was created for her so that she could see her work being transferred to see what on the screen, to see what would work and what wouldn't, and she was able to create everything that she wanted in this way. She joined the team of the first Mac in 1984. Then she went on to work for Bill Gates. She designed all of the icons for Windows 1, 2, and 3. She went to work for Facebook, where she created 15,000 virtual GIFs in images. And as all of these emojis, well, some of these GIFs would become emojis, the one we know today, for the most part. And we would come across a huge number of digital objects in Japan that resemble those emojis. So there's a meeting of minds between Japanese emojis and the work of Susan Kerr. She created the objects that we use every day and to express our emotions, and she's someone who's impossible to ignore. She's 76 years old today, and she's just changed jobs. She used to work for Pinterest, and now she works for Pokemon Go. You should go and check out her work. It's really amazing. And I was actually lucky to do an exhibition with her, but she doesn't speak much. I wanted to ask, why did you do that? How did it go with Steve Jobs? I had all of these questions. But in fact, working on this exhibition, it was wonderful, but it was also super hard, because really, when you do an exhibition, the idea is to unveil a personality, to expose someone. And at the end, she said, "My mother was ill, so you understand." Well, I didn't really understand immediately, but I understood at the end that the cross-stitch she would do with her mother, it became pixels, and as a result, the way of thinking and constructing a motive for her was an obvious one. She also tapped into French 19th century caricature that she very much liked. So here on the left, you see those Facebook virtual GIFs and French caricatures on the right. And everything had to be explored for her. And she's praised on the internet, but in a rather odd way. So these were the first 14 images I wanted to show you. The 15th is about 3D printing. I had to mention it, obviously, because we're talking about the art of printing. So we're moving into a new era. Paper is less present, sometimes not present at all. It's a way of bringing this journey to a close. So here we have a Dutch artist who works in Amsterdam, called Paco Rafael, who makes colored animals. We've already seen other types of animals in color, but the interesting thing is that 3D printing gives it a kind of density that doesn't exist in real life, because when you touch a 3D object, it's something excessively light. And as a result, you think that something that looks imposing and heavy is in fact very light. 3D printing, if I have to sum it up, is a 3D model that you make on a computer that suits you, and then through printing it will come out in molten plastic filaments that will sit on top of each other to recompose a 3D figure that you had imagined at the start. So this kind of simplicity will always depend on the incredible machines that come out of the heads of the people who invented them. I wanted to complete this presentation with this very beautiful dress by Iris van Herpen, which is made from 3D printing, then assembled by the designers, colleagues, collaborators, and somehow give this floating effect, because it's light, but at the same time it's imposing. Sometimes it also looks like paper, almost fabric, but it's a sort of a mix. So, as I mentioned Gutenberg at the beginning, and at the same time as with Gutenberg, copies were still made by hand, and for 250 years copies were made by hand. Printing simply brought in a different technology. So let me reassure you about what we're going through now, about all the revolutionary changes that are coming. Everything goes together, all the techniques hybridize, and we can also be confident in the way we are returning to the hand and manual techniques. In the last 2 years, I've seen so many people in their 20s setting up publishing houses, small publishing houses, stationers. There's a return to wanting to do a lot of things by hand and to using all the techniques I've just mentioned. So all of these people are training. I'd encourage you to get to know these techniques too, because they can be exciting and fascinating. And they can take you in your creative desires to some pretty amazing places. And now engraving, printing, screen printing, embossing, stamping, folding, and hot foil stamping. Many printing savoir-faire's. We'll be talking to Mélody Maby-Przedborski, Communications Development Manager at the Imprimerie du Marais, and Louise Le Moan, Communications and Events Manager at l'Imprimerie du Marais. The stage is yours. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Constance, for this introduction. Thank you, Joseph, for that wonderful macro vision of the history of printing. Instead, we're going to offer you a micro vision of printing, of the history of printing, even if it's also in pixels, with a beautiful mosaic of the printer's skills. So the know-how of the printer, we wanted to ask an initial question, printers, or in the plural, or printer in the singular. also to tell you with Mélody, we're going to tell you a story that is the story of the Marais printing works, for which we work. If we want to talk about the printer's skills, we would have to talk about different skills, know-hows. As Joseph said, there's a whole range of ancillary related and complementary trades without which printers couldn't work. So we will talk about printing from the point of view of the work we do at l'Imprimerie du Marais, printing works located in the Marais neighborhood in Paris, because ultimately there are 1,001 ways of embellishing the paper that brings us together today. And all of these methods are based on skills that are quite specialized, segmented. We see screen printers, embossers, gilders, stampers, bookbinders, typesetters, packaging specialists working side by side. And it's quite rare to find all of this expertise under the same roof. So when it comes to increasingly complex combinations, when you look at the history of printing as well, coordinating all of these skills is an extremely important task, and it's an extremely complex challenge too. It's also linked to a moment and a movement that we saw developing at the Marais Printing Works. We are a printing house based in the heart of Paris since 1971. We've worked a lot with fashion, initially in the ready-to-wear sector, but we've also been part of these major movements, trends in fashion and art, which have become more international. Events have developed. In the end, the complexity of the invitation has increased, whether it was a small Bristol paper gilded in a magnificent studio of an exceptional gilder, or a business card that was absolutely magnificent in its embossing or stamping, because it represented the codes of a noble impression. And Joseph has talked about the emergence of graphic design, and we've also lived through a time when design would become print design, when typography was magnificent, images were fantastic, but graphic designers came up with concepts that were ultimately more in the realm of the object. They would give us briefs that were completely outside of the norm of a typical Bristol board invitation or a leaflet, and we would become engineers cum printers. And it was at that time in the 70s, 80s that the Imprimerie du Marais changed completely, turned on its ear. And the issue of coordinating various skills highlighted by Louise arose. Yes, that's right. And there was this focus on, in the 1930s, this Art Deco period that followed Art Nouveau and arts and crafts, where a lot of things were blended between artists, craftsmen and advertisers. At the turn of the 80s and 90s, there was a similar impetus, a similar new boom. There were very strong bridges being built and a great deal of creativity in these circles, which at the same time gave ideas to our current co-directors, who are the heirs of Charles Przedborski, who was our founding father in both the literal and figurative sense. And at the time there was this idea of really an intuition that we had to incorporate these various trades and play on the interactivity of skills within the same production chain. And that's why we decided to focus on that. And I would say it is still daring today to do so. And there are three major benefits to this modus operandi. Firstly, you save time in terms of delivery time. It might seem a little prosaic, but when you're dealing with orders in a sector that is becoming increasingly event-driven, the delivery issue is really key. And we can have complete control of the graphic production chain, but also the support we provide in terms of design support. So thanks to this proximity of expertise within the same space, there's a great deal of emulation, which means we can go further in terms of creativity and technical expertise as well. This pushes back the complexity of the techniques that are used. So we will talk about what we know, and we won't be speaking as knowers, but rather as doers, as guides for projects, as observers of trends. So at l'Imprimerie du Marais, we use techniques that fall into three main families: flatbed printing, the air to lithography. We've already talked about this with Joseph. Then there's relief printing, and finally packaging and finishing. When we often talk about flat and relief printing, and often I see people being taken aback when they come to our printing works, because they see the machines and everything being very flat, because they think of people in a studio. This is their reference, but here the field of reference, our main reference is paper. So in flatbed printing, paper is printed on the surface or in its texture, but it is not deformed, unlike with relief printing. So in the flat printing family, we can mention digital printing, risography, but we mainly work with offset printers, screen printing techniques, which are sister techniques. Offset printing is a four-color printing technique with cyan, magenta, black and yellow, giving us different colors. Here on the image on the left, you see a direct printing color tray. So a color is created on the basis of a made-to-measure Pantone reference system. So it's really a special color that is created, that can be printed, because we've added trays to our offset printing machine, which allow direct printing, and it avoids cleaning, which is the cleaning of the trays, which is very time-consuming. So we are able to produce very creative things in terms of color management, and screen printing too. Joseph mentioned it briefly. I like to say that it's an extremely sophisticated stencil technique. It's quite telling to help you understand this technique. Let's move on to the next slide here. We're going to look at offset printing. It can be very simple, but it can also be very complex, particularly when we work with Pantone prints. All our offsetting operators and screen printers are also colorists, so they can create colors, as I mentioned, and we are able to look for specific effects. Obviously, here I'm just showing you a few examples out of many. Here on the image on the left, this is a packaging that we made to measure for one of our collectibles. We were invited to give a conference in Miami. So we created a slightly lagoon blue packaging on tinted paper, and we generated a green Pantone offset gradient on top. So you can see this slightly gradient effect, which is very technical to achieve. Then we can also do offset printing on gilding. And here the effects are almost akin to pictorialism in photography, a little watercolor-like, with this very beautiful light that is also added, that really enhances the image. We can also work with light and shade, with light tones on dark paper, as shown on the right here, with a metallic Pantone offset print on black paper, again very technical. It takes several passes, often to achieve this metallic effect, and it is also made possible with a specific equipment called UV drying, which creates a kind of semi-permanent varnish. This is a very good image. polymerizing the colors allows to make them much more durable, stronger, longer lasting, and more expressive as well. And it helps us to achieve very complex renderings. There's also screen printing, a very creative technique, which creates a link between the arts and the functional. And it's true that in our professions as artists and craftspeople, we have a lot in common. In screen printing, you often find screen printing workshops in art schools. You have artists who have taken it up. There are legacies to Warhol, of course. And in silkscreen, even if it's flat, you can go for relief by making several passes. So you're inking the design, the printing material several times in the same way, so you get different layers that will create relief. So we're not only talking about an optical aspect, but effect, a haptic one too, which also involves touch in the exploration of creative and artistic printing. Then you can process the image as a bitmap. This is a technique we use in gilding and hot stamping. We're working in dots. These bitmap frames can be processed in very different ways. They can be modulated. You can have a very sfumato effect. The rendering is faithful to what the original intention was. And here on the right, you see a random silkscreen design. This is perhaps the most creative expression of screen printing. From the same design, we can generate several batches of prints on which we can intervene on the colors, but also on the way in which the ink is applied. So we can control the inking in screen printing. The screen printer chooses the level, the quantity of ink. So you can decide to use more or less, to use it in various ways, to create accidents, to have a rough effect rather than a lacquered effect. You can have dripping effects, Pollock style. So there's a very wide range of possibilities that can also be combined or not with other relief printing techniques. So here we're going to talk about printing techniques that are inherited from typography. All the presses that were used in the 70s for letterpress printing, they've been kept at l'Imprimerie du Marais. And we have developed all the engraving expertise, the expertise for using these extremely complex clichés on multiple levels to enable us to do both gilding and embossing of on our papers. So here we're really working with paper as a surface that can be sculpted and refined in order to create effects that also play with light, that can be accentuated or not by a gilding film. You can see here the levels of sophistication of these techniques on the screen. You can gild flat, just digging into the paper with this technique. You can emboss at just one level. This is often done on typography. Margiela is a great expert in this area. So we can simply pass the text and type on one level, but you can also try to sculpt the paper, as you can see in this very fine example of this menu for the Cours Jardin, a restaurant at the Plaza Athénée, where the agency Violaine and Jérémy tried to reproduce the facade of the plaza inside a flower. So this is marquetry. If we look at how it was shaped, and this detail is embossed on multiple levels. This is done using a brass cliché that is machine engraved but also hand finished to get as much detail as possible. So here the paper is deformed and sculpted within the tool. And the example you have in the middle, you see how far we were able to go with this technique by combining stamping and embossing to balance the pressures to obtain all the details of this Janus figure, but also in the hollowed out part and the embossed part. As Joseph has said, at the Imprimerie du Marais, we're also driven by expertise, by our customers' requests. We also want to get our hands, to have a hands-on attitude, process. So we really push forward those techniques. In the last example, you can see tools that are struck again, but here against paper that has been polymerized a little, plasticized a little, and that will become transparent when struck. So these Japanese papers were created in reference to melting snow. The texts here are revealed through the transparency that is created. So all these embossing and gilding techniques are also used with greater subtlety in curved gilding. Here you have an example of this with a diamond tip. We're going to use both film and embossing. The typography will then be sculpted, and you can add a lot of detail to all this lettering. You can combine the techniques you can see on the left and in the middle here on the screen, the technique of microfoiling in the middle. You can also texture the gilding, so you have to imagine something that's very fine. It's like chiseling the material, and these are techniques that were originally used in cigarette packets, when cigarette packets were quite attractive and they were made to look very sophisticated. And l'Imprimerie du Marais has used that technique to work on notebooks to express a lot of refinement, as is used in jewelry in the work that is done on metal. So the last technique here is one that we've tried to push further. The tools you see in the middle are very expensive, quite difficult to engrave. With this, it can take up to 20 hours of engraving to obtain these textured details. We tested that with Alain Ducasse, initially for his menus, and we used bitmap images that were previously used in screen printing. So we tested them in gilding, and the result was very interesting, with a 3D effect almost close to the daguerreotypes that were used in photography. So it opened up a whole new field of exploration. Once you have all these prints in all their variety that have been able to express themselves, it's time to talk about a printed object that can sometimes be very complex. And what allows us to get the final shape, we have a lot of shaping, there's the development, the prototyping and packaging techniques involved. So you have a printed object. There's this very strong idea of a transition from 2D to 3D, and how ultimately we can work in 3D. We've seen this in 2D with very specific techniques for creating relief, but also how we can work in the very construction of the paper, in its cutting, shaping and mounting. Here we see operations that range from the simplest to the most complex for each of them. We have padding operations, which often magnify a volume. You cover it with a textile or leather, or another creative paper another creation in paper that is specially chosen for this object. Then we have assembly operations. When we say assembly, we can talk about stuffing an invitation into a made-to-measure envelope, but we can have more complex operations. Here there's this project for the Bob's Bar under the artistic direction of Violaine and Jérémy. They are also typographers. It's a great craft. You have design studios that also do typography, and they do wonderful work with typefaces. And it's true that Violaine and Jérémy are often involved certain projects, they're digging the history and creativity, and often resulting in extremely rich projects. Here it's a menu they've created as a logbook. The hotel is in French Polynesia, so this is a journey through time and flavors and through intimate and collective history. If you think of Marlon Brando, who bought this hotel, and this island, I won't go into all of the details of this Marlon Brando story, but it's true that after having produced all of these items, you see in both offset printing and silkscreen printing, we created some small photo corners with multi-level embossing that were then glued onto the pages that could be inserted into Polaroid specimens reproduced in offset. So I can tell you that we had 40 pages of this, and the process, the finishing, the assembly was very long and at the same time very joyful. So you have this very complex assembly work, and then the possibilities of pop-up assembly, which is a very good way of expressing 3D in 2D with these small objects.
Then we have more specific techniques. Mélody, you mentioned marquetry on the courtyard menu at the Plaza Athénée, where the meticulous multi-level embossing requires extremely precise positioning to obtain the window effect so that everything falls in the right place. And we have this very precise work in paper marquetry. We can create paper mosaics in an object, producing a very interesting visual effect for colors and textures, which can be found in microstructures and just by working on paper. So to the left, you have an example from Franklin and Till under the management of Commission Studio, a beautiful studio in London. And then there is binding. We work a lot on handmade bindings. You have this one in a Japanese style that completes this very beautiful Japanese design with embossing on this menu, which is one of the 20 menus that we made for the Raffles and Fairmont in Doha hotels. And that's the expression of a huge variety of aesthetics and styles, and shows what we can do with paper. We can express a lot of creativity. And still talking about the Japanese mindset, we can talk about folded paper birds, which are very trendy at the moment. They're used for the Fashion Week because it's a reminder of our childhood, and it's a new relationship to the person you send the invitation to. And all this would not be possible without prototyping, which is essential when you talk about a complex printed object. And when I say a complex printed object, it can be just an envelope, but which is tailor-made. But you can also have more complex things with modular architectures. We can see that with the example in the middle, which is a small case for a USB memory stick that includes the presentation of the architecture firm, Verve Concept. They asked us to work on this, and it's a small pyramid that unfolds. And of course we're referring to the Gizeh pyramids, so that's not very humble for an architecture firm, but it tells a lot. And then, in terms of projects again, I would say this one is a bit of a gem among print design projects. The project we did is one of the tales of the Macallan. It required 1 year in research and development with the Macallan teams. They wanted to create various volumes so that they would design cases for rare whiskies that would pay tribute to their founder. And these objects are books in the English tradition, so it's a heavy, bulky book, all offset printed, and they need to be read like a book of history. But inside the book also needs to be a case to protect a bottle. So this is a Lalique bottle, blown glass, and you see that there is the bottle insert, and it's a bottle, it's glass, so it has to be robust so that the bottle is not going to break. So it's combining a book, a rare book, but it also has to be very practical to protect a beautiful whiskey. The last point we wanted to mention is to talk about eco-design and eco-sourcing. We've talked about prototyping, research, everything that goes into our projects, but we also focus on eco-design solutions. And we have a team working on sourcing. So here is our collection of materials coming mostly from Europe, all of which are repurposed materials from architecture, and that can be used in our prints. And this also is an opportunity for us to talk about the printing industry of the future. For us, printing is moving in the direction of integrating eco-design. And right now, we're capable of working on techniques that have the most positive impact possible using very little or even no fossil fuels at all. Here are 3 examples. I'll start with the one that involves one of the members of the Hermès Foundation workshops, who as part of this conference cycle is also organizing a whole project on expertise. And here we worked with the Paper Foundation, which has set up a whole production cycle with Sew House, where we had to collect old sheets and turn them into paper. So that's what we did, and then they were turned into postcards. So it's a whole supply chain that's being organized, and we do hope that this model will grow and develop, and we'll have many projects with the Paper Foundation. We also printed these tomatoes. This can be in silk printing with mineral ink, and thanks to our suppliers, we are seeing mineral inks emerging with light-sensitive activators, and they can be used with UV printing. So there are developments also that have to be done with our suppliers and the chemists, and we're talking to them about that. But the most pure technique would be to print with no ink, just through pressure, so with pure embossing. Yeah, and as we saw with the example of Sew House, this hospitality chain that developed storytelling through the development of this project for postcards, we see that tailor-made as a sustainable approach is something that we want to support, because very often we have people opposing digital and printed media, saying digital would be more virtuous than printed. Well, many studies today show that the boom of digital technologies can also have a negative impact on sustainable development. And there are also people who say that if you design print media in an artisanal way, you can be very virtuous for the environment. And there is a booming interest for printing and creativity generated by printing, and also when we talk about the fact that impression is an embodiment, we are working on what's real, on what's tangible. We leave a print on paper, like a print in memory. And people who come to see us, whether brands or institutions, they're looking for this emotion, this tangible emotion in the production of printed documents. And they're aware that they're going to do less, but do better, generate sophisticated and complex printed objects requiring a lot of technicity, but these will be limited editions, they will be targeted, and will better target communication. So we're talking about targeted communication and not mass communication. So we're out of this, and thanks to this targeting, we can communicate very powerful emotions. This is what you can see with the Brandenburg prints. There is a communication between a brand and an artist, and that can lead to very creative things. And then you can see that through the action of certain professionals. They want to develop collections of prints. And all these limited editions, precious editions, become collector's items. And of course, we had this feeling because we, as printers, we want to be a library for resources and archives and objects that we created. So we have our own best-ofs. I mean, everybody in our printing house have their own collector's items. But as we talked with Sophie Abria, she's a journalist, she specializes in communication and the luxury industry, and she interviewed us for a Swiss newspaper, and she was telling us that printed objects were very trendy in on second-hand markets, and they were exchanged and sold. And brands are going to think about better sustainability, and they will make sure that there is still a link, and they will make sure that these objects are kept by the people who receive them as objects of decoration, because they were designed to be very beautiful, but also as objects for storing things, like bags, for instance. So we didn't think about it, but it shows that this escapes us. And look, this is an invitation for the Fashion Week by Balmain of 2022, and that's already presented on a pedestal. I mean, everything shows that we moved from a mere invitation to a collector's item. So this is the mindset that we have when we work. We work to print on paper, but also to leave an imprint in people's memories. And this approach is creative and sustainable. It is all the more sustainable when life in the workshop is passed on, when the workshop continues to attract young talents. And at Marais Printing House, we work a lot on passing on expertise and knowledge. As Joseph said, we get a feeling that a large number of young people want to come back to this profession. So they have to train in the workshop. It's a bit difficult because it's difficult to move from design to production to the world of big machines. So you need to learn, and you learn it by experiencing how to set the machines, how to maintain the machines. And today we are faced with many challenges to pass on this knowledge, and I'm so happy that 400 people are gathered in this room today to listen to us talking about our know-how, because it's very easy to recruit people in communication, in marketing, but for talented people working on the machines, it's more difficult, and these are the person we need for the future of the printing industry. Yes, transmission is important. Thanks for listening to us. Dear Clément, well, thank you for opening up the pages of the history of paper. Here we are. We'll leave you with the bookmark to guide us through this story, which is both aesthetic and technical. Yeah, hello everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today. I'll talk about how important photography is. The importance of paper in photography. There is certainly something a bit pedantic starting a presentation with a Latin quote. I'm fully aware of it, but I couldn't help myself. So I'm not a Latin scholar, and I would not be able to pronounce this quote properly. But my grandfather, who was a professor of Latin, taught me the meaning of this quote from Tacitus. And since I started working on this speech for today, I kept thinking about it, thinking about the quote, thinking about my grandfather. So this quote means that you admire more what goes away. So it's being translated in different ways, but this is the translation I chose for today. And I think we all experience this in love. The further away the object of our love is, the more important it becomes. So more broadly, and I'll try to be a bit lighter, because I'm sitting at a small table that you normally find in a bar. So I'd say that this is something that we've all noticed in our modern societies. We often start to take an interest in something when that very thing disappears. I have an example that often comes to mind, which is the example of the Carnavalet Museum in Paris, which began collecting signage, you know, the signs that used to hang in front of shops that were intended to explain what the shop was selling, because there were very few shop windows, so people needed to have a sign that told them what the shop was about. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, as it became possible to extend the windows, because it was possible to have larger glass panels, shops started investing in large glass panels, and it became easier to display what the store was selling. And then, when they were designing their shop windows, they eliminated their signs. And this is when photographies like Eugène Ager began to photograph them, and this is when Musée Carnavalet said, okay, there is something interesting here. This type of object is disappearing. We have to keep a trace of that. So we tend to admire more what is disappearing, both in time and space. And in photography, isn't it the same thing with paper? Because today, as shown by this work by Jeff Guess, most of our photographies exist as pixels which are aggregated on a screen. So this is a large format work. You see a still image of a motion. It shows pixels that combine into an image. But that talks about the transformation of the material of an image. So once upon a time, photography was mostly available on paper. To be more specific, photography was first available on metal. So these are the three ages of photography. First, metal. The oldest photography is by Nicéphore Niepce, which you can see to the left of your screen. It was shot in 1826 or 1827. That's probably not the oldest one, but it's the oldest one that's preserved, and it's kept in Austin, Texas, in a university. And by the way, if you go to Austin, take time to go and look at this extraordinary object. It's a wonderful experience. I mean, you walk in Austin University and you choose between two objects, two small objects. One is square, the other one is round. The round is a Gutenberg Bible that's kept in the same collection. So the very first days of the printing press. And in another window, or showcase, you don't know why the showcase for the Bible is round and the other one is square, but in this window that looks like Fort Knox with bolted plates, this small plate by Niepce is kept and protected by rare gas, and it's extremely well preserved. And you have this small plate, which is the oldest photography that has been preserved. And this image, which is very important because next year will be the bicentennial anniversary of this picture. There are uncertainties as to whether it was shot in 1826 or 1827. So we'll celebrate this anniversary for 2 years. But this small plate was printed on tin. And the early days of photography in France were on metal. And daguerreotypes, with the technology invented by Louis Daguerre in the 1840s, were printed on copper plates. So tin, copper, and other metals. So these were the early days of photography. Then there's 1850, and I'm not talking about the very first experiments. I'm talking about common use. As of 1850, these were the days of paper photographies. And it lasted, well, it's difficult to have accurate dates, because, you know, in history, when you open a door, you close another one and vice versa. But the era of paper continued until the end of the 20th century, beginning of 21st century. We started looking at pictures on screen as of the 1990s. The Apple iPhone was released in 2007, for instance. So that was a phase when people started looking at photographies on screen more and more. So of course we still have paper photographies today, no doubt about that. They're still in circulation, but a majority of people look at pictures and photographs which are not printed. They are watched on a thin layer of glass on a screen. And this is a new era for photography, which is no longer on paper, but it will be on glass or plastic. And this era is short as compared to the metal era or the paper era, but I think we're at a turning point in our relationship to photography. So there was a paper moment in photography. But apart from paper makers who were wondering how they could make this paper to make it more durable, less expensive. And apart from some artists and photographers who were interested in the quality of the paper they used to print their photographies, there are very few people interested in photography who developed a real interest to the matter of paper in photography. And to prepare for my talk this morning, I scanned my library, which contains thousands of books on photography, and couldn't find one single book, not even an essay, on the topic of paper in photography. The only thing I found, and to be honest, I looked very hard for it, and is this exhibition catalogue, an exhibition that was organized in Rives, in the French Alps, where there is a large paper industry, so 150 years of photography of paper, on paper, and just this small booklet about paper in photography. Paper was at the heart of photography for a century and a half, but this was not the object of a great attention. In fact, paper is kind of a blind spot in the 20th century history of photography. So we could turn the quote I mentioned and say that we have little interest to what is very close to us. And even the date of this catalogue is interesting, because for me it corresponds roughly, 1997, it corresponds to the time when I realized that screens were gradually going to replace paper. And as paper was beginning to disappear, to fade away, in the 1990s, 2000, we felt an interest that was gaining ground. And there was a particular interest in calotype. Calotype is a process that uses a paper negative. So let me go back here. We have to go back to the very beginnings of photography. And we go to the UK, because when the very first French operators, Niepce and Daguerre, were experimenting on metal, in England, Talbot was trying to develop photographies on papers. Talbot invented something which was very important, which is the negative-positive process. Okay, sounds very abstract today and difficult to understand when you're born in the days of internet and digital pictures. But the paper negative, the principle is in a dark chamber, in a large camera, you have a medium covered with a photosensitive material that modifies with light. You place this in the black chamber. Then there is an image that's printed on this paper negative, which you remove from the black chamber. You dip it in liquid that reveals the object, and that's a negative. The part of negative that was imprinted with light becomes black. Those that did not receive any light become clear. And then you take this simple piece of paper, place it on another piece of paper, expose it to the sunlight. This is what you can see here, where you can see sheets of paper. And with the sun, the dark parts on the negative become clear parts on the print, and vice versa, so that from a negative you get a positive image. Why is it important? Well, because the metal process by Niepce and Daguerre, even though they both experimented with metal and paper, but the metal process, which is the first reference to photography, at least in France, is unique. You can just have one image. You can't reproduce them. The only way you can reproduce them is to take another big photography with the metal place. But here with the Talbot process, you can print as many positive images as you want. So what Talbot introduces through this negative positive process, or what he calls Talbotype, is the reproducibility of photography, and we know how important this is because it allows disseminating photographies thanks to these negative positive.
The images of Niepce and Daguerre are unique. Talbot's images are multiple. And it is interesting to note that the Talbot's book, which Joseph was talking about this morning, exists in several copies. And I'd like to pick up on what Joseph was saying this morning. Anna Atkins actually produced one of the very first of these books. I would prefer to call it a photographic work because the images are not made in a dark room, and I want to make the distinction between the two, although we know that the question of invention is always extremely relative. It depends on where you're talking from, what you want to emphasize. But indeed, Anna Atkins probably produced one of the very first photographic books. Talbot, for his part, produced the first photography book, images taken in the darkroom, that existed in multiple copies and that were distributed. Here you can see both the cover and the operators making the image in the photographic printing press that was set up by Talbot. Talbot himself produced a number of the images published in Pencil of Nature. This one in particular, it's really an extraordinary image. It's a paper negative. I wanted to show you a few examples of paper negatives. So you see it on the left of this screen, which when placed on a high sensitized sheet produces the positive you can see on the right of the screen. So Talbot made these images. These date from 1844. It's called the Haystack, and it's an extremely important image because it's part of his work, again, the Pencil of Nature. And in this book, Talbot is trying to demonstrate with each image that is published, he wants to demonstrate the capabilities of the new photographic medium with prints that are pasted directly into the book at the time. And there in his mind was the desire to say that whereas for a painter or draftsman it would probably take hours to represent each of the strands of this haystack, the photographer, however, captures it in the blink of an eye. And perhaps the premise is that this photograph is a way to find a needle in a haystack. I also really like this negative of Baron Louis Adolphe Humbert de Molard called Two Hunters. The year is 1851. We are in the midst of the calotype era. The 1850s were really the heyday of the calotype, mainly in France and England too. Mainly those two countries. So Humbert de Molard, he owned a property at Lagny-sur-Marne and staged a lot of performances with his servants, the overseers of his estate. And here you have two hunters portrayed by one of his servants, that's how he describes him, and the steward of his estate. And the beauty of the calotype is that it's an extremely velvety image. Obviously, the screen doesn't do it justice, But I do hope that one day you will have the good fortune of seeing them in an exhibition, seeing examples of calotypes. These are incredibly velvety images. You can feel the paper when you look at a calotype. For instance, when you speak of a daguerreotype, it's extremely precise, very detailed, almost to the point of hurting the eyes. Well, the calotype has a velvety quality due to the fact that the paper negative diffuses light. This is something we will lose later with glass negatives and then celluloid negatives, where we have a perfect transparency, and so the images come out very precise. But there was a time, particularly in the 1850s, the calotype period, when images had a particularly magnificent velvety quality. Here you also have an image of Louis-Rémy Robert, the head of the glass painting workshop from the Sèvres porcelain factory. He would later become the director of this institution. He was passionate about photography, a great amateur, and produced a number of beautiful calotypes. And then there's a magnificent portrait of the photographer Henri Le Sec, photographed here by his friend Charles Nègre, on the towers of Notre-Dame. Another image that really shows this great quality. And then one last example, a photograph of John Beasley Green, the son of an American banker who had settled in France. And John B. Green had an absolutely fascinating career. He was a young man with two passions, Egyptology and photography. He set up two expeditions to Egypt in the 1850s. He was barely in his 20s, he was very young indeed, and he brought back hundreds of photographs taken in Egypt. He died on his second exhibition in Cairo, aged 24, but in just 4 or 5 years of working with calotypes, he left behind one of the finest collections of calotypes from its early days in the history of photography. And here you see a view of a column. I really like this little path leading to the column. You can also see that the column in the negative on the left is leaning a little. You have to imagine a big dark room on a stand in the sand. It's not going to be very easy, but he straightened it out when he made his print. So in the 1990s and 2000s, there was a real fascination with the calotype and the paper negative. So we would see a lot of exhibitions, also publications. The calotypes would be brought out of collections, exhibiting the negative and the positive as often as possible, to show that these are images that also have a particular mode of production, which is that of the paper negative. And sometimes the negative is as beautiful or even more beautiful than the print itself. There's a kind of abstraction sometimes in the negative, which is quite beautiful. And then came the time in the 1990s and 2000s when, almost unconsciously perhaps, we began to sense that paper was starting to fade away or move away. So in a move that has often been described as a new old-fashioned photography, many photographers started to make calotypes. We had a moment when photographers, contemporary artists, wondered how things were done in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century in particular, what were the materials and the techniques that were used. So a number of photographers took up the calotype. And this is the case of the French photographer Martin Becker for work entitled Territoire, produced in Switzerland. He works mainly with paper negatives and paper negatives with a specific paper, laid paper. So it's quite interesting because you can see that the laid paper and these fine parallel lines are themselves imprinted and part of the production of the positive image, and they almost end up playing with the subject, which in this case, at least in two of the photographs that are quite geometric, and you see that they're made up of lines, and so there's a kind of interaction between the photographic material and the image deposited on its surface. So as paper was starting to fade away or disappear from photography, here we didn't close one door and open another. These are rather moments of intertwining both. We still have paper today. I work mainly with paper today, and I'm in charge of a collection of 30,000 prints. But it is clear that screens are becoming increasingly important in everyday use. So at the time, I was quite fascinated to see that for all the decades of the paper era, very little had been created around paper to talk about paper itself, and at that point, around the year 2000, a number of artists began to take an interest in paper. And that's what I would like to talk to you about now, by taking a few examples of artists who are making proposals, plastic proposals, aesthetic proposals around this question of paper. So this is the case, for instance, of Alison Rossiter. She's also a paper restorer. She has worked for major American collections. So she's someone who restores paper photography stemming from the 19th century, the 20th century, and she has worked in particular on building up collections of old papers. There are several places today in the United States which are creating collections of photographic papers. In other words, they buy old boxes of paper from the early 20th century, from the 1920s, 1930s. They buy them from different websites, online sites, so that they can build up examples of samplings that they use then to analyze the works they have to restore in their studios. So Alison Rossiter herself has collected those boxes. When you go to a studio, you see boxes, these orange boxes of paper that obviously are all out of date. And photographic papers have expiry dates, after which the silver contained in these papers is less active, and a moment when the papers themselves undergo alterations. And that's what is of great interest to Alison Rossiter, because she collects these expired papers, and over the years these papers have become oxidized, sometimes they're faded, sometimes they're even covered in mold. If you buy a box of paper from the 1920s in an old flea market, it is covered in dust. Sometimes a little piece of the box has a hole in it. The light has penetrated the box and has dimmed or obscured the paper. And that's precisely what is of interest to her. She has developed and fixed these papers and assembled them into compositions like the ones you can see on the screen. The titles are quite interesting. Here in the middle of the screen, the work is called Agfa Brovera Cashmere White. It's a brand of paper offered by Agfa in the 1940s, and she adds expired in June 1946, developed in 2015. So the process itself is important here for the artwork. And depending on the way she develops these papers, the way she dips them in the developer tray, sometimes also the way they have been obscured over time, or they have been oxidized. This creates different densities of oxidation that end up recreating a kind of landscape. How can one possibly overlook the work of the German artist Thomas Demand? You may have seen his exhibition at the Jeux de Paume in Paris 2 years ago. Demand is an extraordinary German artist who builds huge paper sculptures on a life-size scale. He's almost as much a sculptor as he is a photographer, in fact. He owns very large collections of paper in his studio, and these collections of paper have different thicknesses and different colors. And he often responds to a photograph he has seen in the press and the media. He does not create worlds entirely from his imagination. It's often small photos found in the media, a particular moment, images that carry historical depth. And so in his studio, he recreates these images at full scale from the point of view of the camera to obtain a sculpture on a one-to-one scale that matches exactly the press photograph that inspired him. But what is interesting here is that in these images there is often also a reference to the paper itself. That's the subject of the original image, but it's also an area to which he pays particular attention. For instance, the office you see here is that of the secret police in former East Germany, at a time when it was ransacked after the fall of the wall. And the papers that you see, they're strewn all over the floor. Here, in this image called Archive, we see an archive belonging to the German director and photographer Leni Riefenstahl, who, as you know, played a large part in the propaganda that glorified the Nazi regime. So again, paper, boxes of photographic prints, and here in this last image, a studio, an office. That's the title of the work, an office, an archive, a workshop or studio. In other words, places made of paper, where we find paper rather. And in fact, the studio here, as you may have guessed, is Henri Matisse's studio in Nice, where he produced his famous papier découpé until the end of his life, the paper cutouts. So I have to admit that the first time I saw this image and read the caption, I said to myself, it must have something to do with Matisse. In any case, it triggered a neural connection that made me think of Matisse's paper cutouts. And it wasn't until I checked out, because it doesn't say so in the exhibition or it doesn't say so in the catalogue, but after doing a bit of research, I realized that it was actually Matisse's studio in Nice. And that's important too. I'm digressing here. But in works of art, there's an unconscious part that is sometimes much more important than all the didactics that may surround this image. And that's something, especially when you're doing a talk like this, that you always have to remember. There is pedagogy, didactics. There are things that we know, but there are also things that we have an intuition of, and that is also extremely important. I would also like to talk briefly about the work of the New York artist Erika Baum, who for the last 20 years now has been making images whose material and subject are prints and all the popular and vernacular culture that is conveyed by paper. Because that's what paper is also all about. It's also very popular, it's also vernacular. I particularly remember the smell of the La Redoute catalogues that my mother would receive and that I used to leaf through. I particularly remember the feel of the late paper of the first books, the first little oblong books from the publishing house Actes Sud. I remember that, and I think it's important in our relationship to paper. The smell, the touch, they're essential. Each paper has its own materiality. You know that already, of course. A materiality, a smell that can conjure up memories. And that's precisely what Erica Boehm's work is based on. And obviously, before concluding, I wanted to mention another German artist, Wolfgang Tillmans, who has just opened an extraordinary exhibition at the Centre Pompidou. And I highly recommend this exhibition, which opened 2 days ago. It's a wonderful exhibition, and it's quite different from previous exhibitions of Wolfgang Tillmans' work. We've seen a lot of exhibitions in capital cities around the world in recent years by this artist, and this one is very special. It plays with the place, it plays with the materiality of what is being exhibited. And this is what I'd like to focus on now for a moment. Since 2001, Wolfgang Tillmans has been making what he calls paper drops. So these are drops made out of paper. He has made several of them. There are a few in the exhibition I was talking about at the Centre Pompidou. And it's simply a photograph that has been placed on a table, work table, and it's slightly folded on itself. And by playing on the reflections of the photographic print, it ends up looking like a drop. In other words, photographic paper. So what I find very beautiful here is that the drop of water falls vertically, and the drop of paper here lies horizontally. So perhaps there's something here to be said for paper, something to meditate. So that's it. We tend to admire more readily what moves away. I'm coming back to my initial quote. And I have the feeling that in photography, at least, paper moves away for better or for worse, as they say at weddings. But paper remains nonetheless, and it remains in the vision and practice of a number of artists, and we should thank them for that. Thank you very much for your attention. Next up is Lomique Perrotin, who defines himself as the world's smallest manufacturer of photographic paper. Or is it the world's smallest company producing photographic paper? I think there's a mistake in my speech here. No, there isn't. We wanted to focus on this specialty. Thank you very much, Lomique, for accepting our invitation and coming all the way from Brittany to meet us. Hello everyone, my name is Lomique Perrotin and I am the founder of Film Washi. Film Washi is in fact the smallest company in the world making photographic film and paper, simply because I work on my own, and as you can see I'm not very tall, so I'll probably remain the smallest for a long time to come. So Film Washi started in 2012 with a personal project. In other words, I wanted to make a photographic film myself, and in order to do that, I was inspired by the first negatives in the history of photography. Clément told you about them, in particular the color types of Henry Fox Talbot in England and Hippolyte Bayard also in France. So, well, making film on plastic is more complex. With photo emulsions, if you take a piece of plastic, of course, it's not going to stick to it. There's a whole industrial process involved to do so. So I turned to paper and to Japanese paper in particular. So here I have to thank my partner because she was the one who steered me towards this paper. At first I tried on tracing paper, it didn't work very well. Japanese paper, called washi, simply means traditional paper in Japanese, and it is used in particular for watercolors, so it can survive literally going through photochemical baths. It's also flexible, supple, easy to handle, and sufficiently transparent to be used as a negative. So here again, I'd like to thank Clément for his explanation of the positive-negative process. So when I carried out my first test coating strips of Japanese paper with photosensitive gelatin and running them through a camera, I was struck by the very special aesthetic that emerged, because you have all of these organic fibers mixed together in this handmade paper, and they blend directly into the image. And it has a beauty that is really particular and that indeed recalls the aesthetic of the early days of photography, and in particular the pictorialist aesthetic that developed greatly in the early 20th century. So it was an aesthetic in which photographers wanted to go against the grain of what was done with glass plates and the first plastic films, which were very precise. They wanted to leave an imprint. They wanted us to see their action on their print and even on their negative. So in fact, it was an aesthetic where the transcription of a sensation was more important than the raw reality of the very subject. And that's what interested me. So I started doing tests on the films I was making, taking photos. So here we see a negative in its development tray. I'm showing it to you from a distance. So the negative is literally made of paper. And little by little, I received requests from other friends, photographers who came to see me and would say to me, I'm interested. Could you sell me a few rolls, a few packs of that film? I'd love to experiment with it. There were also boutiques, shops to whom I was showing my results. And they would say, sell us these films and we'll sell them for you in our shop. So little by little, what was originally a purely personal project as a photographer became a business in 2013, and I created this company that I called Film Washi. So in the beginning, everything was very simple. The laboratories were the cupboards in my flat. I heated the emulsions in my kitchen, and in the evening in front of the TV, I would make my packaging out of craft paper. Even the glue was made from flour. So everything was made on a very small scale. Since 2013, Film Washi has diversified. I'm still on my own, but I'm doing other things as well, particularly in the field of photographic film. And as far as film on Japanese paper is concerned, I must have produced more than 12,500 copies. If you compare it to the paper factories at Ilford or paper factories at Foma or Kodak, it's nothing at all. It's 3 seconds of their production. Over the years, I've also collaborated with other artists to share my expertise of sensitizing various media. So I sensitized large sheets of silicone for Thomas Deveau, for instance. It was very complicated because the emulsion comes off in the bath, so I had to manage to keep it in contact with the silicone In fact, silicone is made for pie dishes, pie plates, they're not really designed to stick. So for Magali Lambert, I also did some sensitized glass objects. You can see them here on the screen, and it was very interesting because it was a collaboration with an artist who came to see me, and also with the laboratory of Diamantino Quintas, who is a great professional photo printer in Paris, in Bagnolet. I would do my part, and he would print the negatives on those glass objects for the artists. You also have to realize that right from the beginning, there were users who would use my film on paper, as I'm showing you here, to make prints. So in other words, instead of placing it inside the camera, they would take it off the reel, the spool, put it under the enlarger, project it onto a negative, projected a negative onto it to obtain a positive. And then the positive was on a Japanese paper. And it was very beautiful. So I said to myself at the time, well, there might be an opportunity to dig a little here, to go further and to continue this approach, but not just to make photographic paper or film, but also to make photographic paper, printing paper. Not least because in the end the physical constraints and the chemistry are more or less the same. It's very similar. It all clicked when in 2016 I was contacted by a very large manufacturer of handmade Japanese paper called Agawami Factory, who makes some very, very beautiful products. They contacted me and offered me a collaboration, and they said, we've seen what you do, are you interested in using our paper to make your products? Naturally, I accepted.
It was incredible because I had a fairly limited understanding of Japanese paper based on those papers that I had tested and used for my production. And all of a sudden I discovered an entire new world because there was an incredible variety of materials. There were extremely thick materials used to make partitions in traditional Japanese houses, very thick, very textures. I was not going to use them for film, but there were things that were very completely diaphanous, used for restoring precious work, 2 grams per square meter. And when I tried to work on it, the paper disintegrated because the weight of the emulsion was more important than the weight of paper. So I made tests and I selected a specific paper based on Gampi fiber and clay, and that gives a beautiful transparency, beautiful texture, and I chose it to make another film. And then I chose other papers for printing, one based on bamboo fiber, very beautiful, very regular, very fine, quite remote from what I was using for the negatives. And I started testing to come up with a range of printing paper. And I announced that at the photography exhibition in October 2017. The new packs of this new paper started selling last week. So you don't want to make announcements too much ahead of time. That's the lesson I learned, because everybody kept calling and saying, when is the paper ready? So there you go. What you need to know is that the very first photography papers in the history of photography were not very sensitive, and they didn't keep over time. And very often, the photographers themselves, they took paper and they prepared it by placing it in a bath of silver chloride, and they would use it the very next day. So that's why we are back with Talbot, because the result were images that were sort of borrowed in the paper, in the fiber of the paper. So if you were to cut the paper transversely, you wouldn't be able to make a difference between the support and the image layer. It's really embedded in the paper. But little by little, with progress and technical advance in photographic paper, we obtained papers that were more and more specific. There was the invention of the gelatin emulsion with bromide, with silver salts that are dissolved in gelatin and then coated on the paper. So the image is no longer directly in the fiber, slightly above it. Then you have the barium paper, so you have a layer of barium sulfate that's interposed between the basis of the paper and the photosensitive gelatin to have a very white backdrop for the image. And that's the very beginning of industrial papers. The disadvantage is that there is a disconnect between the image and the paper base. And then you go to modern papers, plasticized paper, where the paper pulp is just a skeleton trapped between two layers of plastic resins which are totally waterproof. And the image is above the paper and separated from the paper. But for me, for this new printing paper, I didn't want to be just reproducing an old process like album in paper or calotype. As Clément said, I work in niche paper, so we can't think about large-scale production and selling to a large audience, because it wouldn't be viable from a commercial perspective. Likewise, given the size of my company, I can't think of industrial production, because the Japanese paper that I use are handmade in Japan and sold as sheets. And you can't put them on rolls in a big machine. That's impossible. So it suits me. It suits the way I do things. I'm halfway between something very artisanal and something industrial. So what's my working environment? Because, as I said, in the beginning I worked in a cupboard. 3 square meters, the films were above me, they were drying above me, and I was walking back, and I was in Paris back in the days. Then I moved to Saint-Nazaire, and I started working in the garage of the house where I lived. So my working space was multiplied by a factor of 20, which allowed me to diversify my business. And over the last 5 years, I decided to move to Josselin in Brittany, between Vannes and Rennes. And my workshops are in former containers that used to be used by the French army. And what's good with these containers is that it's quite modular, and each container corresponds to one activity. I have one which is refrigerated for storing the emulsions and the paper, another one where I have admin, etc., etc. And they came in partly equipped. There was heating, electricity. One of them was already used for photography, and it was placed on the tarmac to develop pictures taken by the aircrafts. And no photography company in the world works at my scale. There is a huge gap between me and I don't even call them my competitors, it wouldn't make any sense. I mean, the Kodak plant in the US is probably the size of the city where I live. The Kodak machine or the FOMA machine in the Czech Republic is probably the size of this theatre, and the theatre is just a part of this machine. So the way I work in sensitizing the material is less stable, less controlled than in a Kodak-like factory. But I have an advantage, because when they manufacture with huge machines in total darkness, well, for me, I am the machine. I am the machine. So it means that I'm the one working on the paper. I can see what I do, and if there is a defect or a problem, I can see it and I can remove it from production. So we have a quality control which is done in real time. And that brings me to the question of quality, because printing paper is a very demanding product in terms of quality. And I'm not going to say that films are not as demanding, but it's different. But printing paper is the final product in the photography process. That's what you're going to show, to exhibit, to display on a wall. So you don't want to have any defect. And by making this paper, I was showing it to people who wanted to have a pictorial film, who wanted something with a very marked imprint, with small accidents, like in silk printing. Sometimes in my paper there can be a small variation, but for a printing paper, that's something that you can't have. These are samples with defects, with problems of emulsions, with artifacts that happen. But for me, to have the best possible quality, I work with an industrial emulsion. I'm not like 19th century photographers. I don't produce my own emulsion. I procure it from a competitor that produces millions of films, and I procure industrial emulsion, which is stable with constant quality. That gives a photosensitive layer which is always the same. So the benefit is to have an industrial production that combines with the beauty of a product which is made by hand. Because there is this repetitive gesture of coating paper, one sheet after the other. And it took me years to do that properly. And even today, depending on the temperature, I have to adjust my gesture. And this is why it took me so long, because printing paper is much thicker, less easy to handle, not as transparent as the paper that I used for the negatives. So you can see that there is this constant exercise to strike the right balance, to retain what's going to make this paper beautiful and eliminating what's not good enough. So it's like walking on a tightrope. And once the product has been packaged and is shipped to the photographer, the question I always have in mind is it going to be good enough? So far, so good. But sometimes I cheat, because I work in the dark. You may know that you can handle photography paper under red light. But if you do that for too long, it turns bad. So I work in total darkness. so that when the paper gets to the photographer, it's never seen the daylight. So I work with night vision goggles in darkness, which I had to make myself because as nobody works at my scale, there aren't many tools. So I have to recycle and transform everything I use. And the first coils I used were made with the engine of cassette players. Now I use the engine of the windows of the cars. But these night vision goggles that I had to design myself allow me to see in the dark, so I can avoid hurting myself. It allows me to see some defects. But the benefit is that it's slightly green vision that you have, and you don't see the relief that much. And in infrared, if you cut yourself and you bleed, you don't see it. You can't see. I don't know if I'm bleeding out on the paper I'm working on. And it happened, by the way. I didn't bleed out, but I did cut myself. So it's kind of borderline between artisan making and industrial production. So I'm getting to the end of my presentation, and maybe you'll have questions. But here is a question. Why doing that in 2025? Why going through so much trouble to make this photography paper? Well, you'd be right to ask this question, but in photography, what's interesting is the relationship between paper and the medium. You've seen a shift between metal and paper and then plastic. And as photography progresses, we get rid of paper and we move to digital image, which is, in a way, a pure image. And it can be printed on absolutely everything, even media which is not neutral. And we're back to our starting point. And at the Wagami factory, when they contacted me, they had a range of printing paper. And when they talked to me, it's because they were looking for something different. But what was it? And if you go back to the beginning of film washi, it was a personal idea, and then photographers that took ownership of my idea to express their own artistic sensitivity, which is different from mine, and which is sometimes far more interesting than mine. In photography, my customers are far better than me. And it's not a joke, it's very true. And the true question is not why, but for whom. And I hope that if this new production of photography paper, which is both modern and handmade in 2025, is to have a meaning and a reason for being, it will be because photographers themselves will give it that meaning. And this is my conclusion. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Bon, c'est évidemment à la fois je suis très heureux puis en même temps c'est une
Hello everyone.
de conclure.
I'm very happy, but it's also with a lot of nostalgia that I'm going to conclude this last morning session of the Academy dedicated to paper. Because as you've seen, and for those of you who've been here since January, and I'd like to thank you all for attending this series of conferences, but you've seen that we've traveled across continents to explore the incredible history of paper. We've lived through the industrial revolutions, we've revisited major inventions, and we've examined paper from every angle. We're exploring every detail, right down to the confettis that surround me. So this bold and ambitious program was designed with the help of Constance Guisset, who managed to organize these morning sessions. So Constance, thank you so much for your dedication, for your trust, good humor, and for the wide variety of paper, costumes, and accessories. Thank you, and she deserves a round of applause. The Hermès Foundation's Academy is a team effort. And of course, I must thank them because under the leadership of Laurent Peugeot, director of the foundation, we have a team including Julie, Victoria, the communication team too, with Anaïs and Hugo. And of course, our friend and partner since the very beginning, Hugues Jacquet. So, they're the ones who designed, organized this ambitious program that takes us ever further in the discovery and understanding of the materials around us. I'd like to thank the 22 speakers in this series that share their knowledge and experience with lots of generosity. And finally, a huge thanks to Lena Mania and Santiago Alvarez, whom you've heard, probably not this morning, but these are comedians training at the art studio in Bobigny, which is supported by the foundation, and they gave you the lectures that you heard during these morning sessions. So in China, the Lantern Festival marks the end of the New Year celebrations, and traditionally made of paper, lanterns symbolize leaving the old year behind you and welcoming the new year. So I have no lantern with me this morning, but it's with joy and nostalgia that I conclude today with you the 7th edition of the Academy dedicated to paper craftsmanship. And I'm pleased to announce that we will meet again in 2 years' time for a new Academy, focusing on a new material that we will reveal in due course. But next year, keep an eye out for the publication of the book on the Academy on paper in the wonderful Actes Sud collection entitled Savoir et Faire. And you will find all the presentations given in the morning sessions, along with other articles coordinated by our friend Hugues Jacquet. And before I hand over to Constance for a surprise, I wanted to dedicate this phrase to Constance: paper suffers in silence under regrets. And that's all.
Before closing this chapter, I would like to say a few words. It has been a great joy, great honor, and so on, as you know. Thank you for coming at 9 a.m. For some, it was more about the folds of your pillow than the folds of paper. Saturday mornings, we know how much it's tough for some of you. So I hope we were up to the task with the lightness and breadth required by this topic. Thank you, of course, to the Fondation Hermès. And this is where I have the same list as you, give or take, but still I'll unravel it, forgive me, with a few slight changes, however. Thank you, Olivier, thank you, Laurent, thank you to all those who have made this program possible with their joy, humor and liveliness. Julie Arnaud, the conductor with a paper baton, of course. Hugues Jacquet, the scholar who laughs at his jokes in advance and gives them to me when he doesn't feel like cracking them himself. So I've been experimenting with them. Thanks to Victoria, our wonderful paper master. Thanks to Hugo, beware of Hugo and the communications team, and also beware of Tazio and his photographs too. You always have to look where it is to make sure everything is seamless. Thanks, of course, to my team. Please forgive me. It is the moment when I can't help but feel some pride. Lucie Verlaguet, my colleague who helped me prepare all of those morning sessions, who proofread the jokes, added some new ones, and prepared everything to ensure it runs smoothly. So Hugues and Lucie are behind the jokes. Thank you to both of you. Thank you to Augustin Collet, who made all the props, except of course for this final piece, which was made by Marie Lomé. So once again, I'm not to blame for this confetti, you are. I also wanted to thank the two readers, Lea Magna and Santiago Alvarez, who put up with my jokes whenever they were around. Thank you to all the paper specialists who came to share their passion in all its aspects, and I do hope that, like me, you leave with your retinas printed with paper fibers and maybe a little confetti in your hair and pockets. Be aware, I've got some in my pockets still, so I'm likely to scatter some of it somewhere. And maybe you'll dream of becoming a super paper fortune teller like I did. In any case, that's what's been driving me all this time. Maybe you'll want to do like Georges Sand and wallpaper your whole interior with paper stripes. We've learned a lot together, and if you're already missing this series of morning sessions on paper, this is the moment when my earpiece starts to crackle. All the previous sessions are already available on YouTube on the channel of the Fondation Hermès. Thank you very much. Make way for the music. We're off again with Max van der Ost and his brass band, a one-man band who is a musician and composer, but not just any musician. He founded the Maison de la Pataphonie, which is, and I quote, a musical kingdom with shifting boundaries. Music is celebrating every day except on the 21st of June, which is the Festival of Silence, as you all know. We're lucky because it's 1 week before the band. Max is a maverick luthier, but what is it? Isn't there a maverick luthier in all of us? Whistles in hand, forward and march. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is my pleasure to introduce you to my paper orchestra. Originally, paper comes from wood. Wood comes from the tree. The tree comes from the forest. And from the primeval forest came insect noises and bird songs. Sounds were born and melodies emerged. Listen up.
Ceux qui connaissent la bande dessinée Astérix,
So those familiar with the Asterix comic strip will join me in feeling sorry for a certain bard who is asked to play without singing, lest he find himself gagged and bound up for no fewer than 10 pages. So here is a cardboard replica of the traditional Gaulish lyre as a tribute to the poor cacophonics. My Gaulish lyre will be accompanied for the cause by this little nose flute, which, as it is suggested, is played with the nose. And I personally invented a brilliant system called the hand-free nose flute, which you will see me playing all the time while on the phone, yet never while driving. Ladies and gentlemen, you may dance.
Je ne pourrais continuer cet exposé.
So of course I cannot go on without mentioning Romain Bigot. Mr. Romain Bigot was an instrument maker. He built instruments in Paris in the 19th century, actually in the second half of the 19th century. Do you know what a kazoo is? It's also called a mirliton.
Eh bien, le kazoo
Yes,
est un
no?
petit dispositif qui
Well,
permet
it
de
is a
transformer
traditional
le son de la
folk
voix
flute
humaine
and a small
en
device
faisant
that
vibrer une petite
transforms the
membrane
sound
qui
of
peut
the
être
human
en
voice
plastique,
by
qui peut être
vibrating
d'origine
a small
végétale, mais
membrane,
également
which
en
can be
papier
made of
de
plastic,
cigarette.
plant
Je vous donne
material,
brièvement
also
le
paper, actually cigarette paper. Let me briefly explain how it works.
Romain Bigot, donc,
So
pour y
Romain
revenir,
Bigot, to
avait
return to the
étudié
subject, had
les
studied the
théories
theories of a
d'un
certain Adolf
et avait
Sachs
décidé
and
de
had decided
de
to
doter
give
le
the
kazoo de
kazoo,
forme généralement cylindrique,
generally
de lui donner
of
une forme, une
cylindrical
colonne
shape,
d'air conique
well,
qui
to
allait
give
en
it a
décupler
conical
la
shape and
puissance.
column of
Et c'est
air
ainsi,
that would
mesdames et
increase
messieurs,
its
que
power
Romain
tenfold.
Bigot a
And so, ladies and gentlemen,
inventé
Romain
le
Bigot
bigophone,
invented the
qui allait connaître
bigophone,
des décennies
which
de
was to enjoy
succès. Vous pouvez aller
decades
voir
of
sur
success.
Wikipédia,
You can
l'histoire
check
est
it out on
vraiment très
Wikipedia.
intéressante.
It's a really
Ici, mon
interesting
bigophone
story.
de facture plus
And here, my
contemporaine, voire
bigophone, which is
sponsorisée,
more contemporary and even
sera
sponsored,
accompagné d'une
it's a
grosse
sponsored
caisse tout
version.
en
It will
carton
be
que
accompanied
certains
by a
esprits
cardboard
facétieux
bass
disent
drum,
d'origine
which
égyptienne.
some mischievous spirits claim to be of Egyptian origin.
Mais que se
But
passera-t-il,
what
diront
will
certains,
happen, some will say, if
si plusieurs de ces
several of
instruments
these
se mettent à
instruments
jouer de
start to give a
concert?
joint performance,
Voici au départ d'un
starting
cajot
with
de
a
fruits
crate of
exotiques
exotic fruits,
une invitation au
is an
voyage
invitation
musical.
to a
Mais attention,
musical
mesdames et
journey.
messieurs,
But
car
beware,
un
ladies
instrument
and
peut en
gentlemen,
cacher
because one
un autre.
instrument may hide another. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This is the moment you've all been waiting for. I'm going to ask you to take the little rectangle of paper that you found on your chairs or that has been placed in your delicate hands. Fold the rectangle in two. Fold over the central fold so that, unlike mine, the little watering can touch the QR code. Then you bend the other two small dotted edges outwards, and you get a figure that looks like a little bird, a child's drawing. You see, it goes chirp, chirp, chirp. I hope you're bilingual. Then, if you're right-handed, you place your hand with the palm facing the ceiling. If you're left-handed, well, you know what I mean. So you place the device between your index and middle fingers. Don't squeeze your fingers too tightly, and with a breath that I'm already guessing is very delicate, blow into the little device between the two sheets of paper. Beware of not hyperventilating. Ladies and gentlemen, every orchestra has a conductor. I ask you for absolute silence. Absolute silence, that is. Can you all count to one? Okay, we'll check. I'm going to count to one myself and play until one. So I show one and play one. One. That's easy. If I show two, I'll count to two. 1, 2. And up to 3, we're going to use a little cha-cha-cha pattern, which is faster, and it will go together. Yes, I don't think I've played that much. Attention, ladies and gentlemen, beware. This is the paper mambo. I'm going to play the solo part. In the first part, you will answer once. In the second part, you will answer 3 times. 3 times yes, you're going to do it when it's time. We have the cha-cha-cha pattern, of course, and the last time we'll have the luxury of playing twice. That way we'll have used all of our little skills from this morning, and off we go. I'm counting on your major concentration. Smile, you're being filmed. Okay, I'll start. And thank you to the Fondation Hermès for this invitation.
Faites du bruit.
Make some noise.